Okay, so we are live. Hello everyone, this is the fifth appointment with the Sveglia Museo on air. We have the pleasure and the honor today to have connected with us Ed Rodley, Associate Director of the Integrated Media at the Peabody Essex Museum in Boston and author of the famous blog Thinking About Museums. Hello Ed.
Hello everybody.
Thank you to be here. And we have also Francesca connected from Sveglia Museo and chatting from Springfield, Virginia. Francesca? Hello? Francesca? Uh-oh.
Do you hear me now?
Can you hear me? It's yes.
I can hear you.
Yes. Sorry. Yeah, of course.
Wonderful.
Of course,
okay.
technical problem. Last minute technical problem.
So we're live.
So,
hello everyone. This is
we have the pleasure and the honor today to have connected with us Ed Rodley, Associate Director of the Integrated Media at the Peabody Essex Museum in Boston and author of the famous blog. Okay. There's. Hello, can you hear?
Hello.
Can you hear a little bit of echo?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, okay. I'm hearing myself talking 5 minutes ago. From Sveglia Museo and chatting from Springfield, Virginia. Francesca?
What's going on?
Francesca, have you opened your YouTube?
No, I closed it. I closed it.
Okay. Now we should be fine. We should be fine. No problem. So Ed is going to talk about.
Please. Start again.
So Ed is going to talk about staff training in the digital era, talking about digital skills that apparently we don't have in handling this hangout. And we have been seeing and also experiencing a lack of awareness in the museum field, not only toward digital tools, for example, how to use Twitter or Facebook, but also toward the mindset that we are supposed to have in the digital transformation. Ed is gone. Francesca. Okay.
Hello.
Hello. Okay. There he is. Okay. So how can we solve this? For example, by one possibility could be to create opportunities for the staff to learn about a certain technology and a certain approach. Not necessarily to have everybody in the museum to become a geek or to tweet the hell out of the collection, but to kind of spread the awareness and the basic knowledge and to get everybody on the same page. So we don't have a representative of an Italian museum today, just because we thought that this could be more of kind of a general discussion that could benefit museums in general and not one in particular. So shall we start?
Sure.
Okay, cool.
Okay. One of the things that I have been increasingly interested in my current role here at the Peabody Essex Museum, specifically since the department I work for is not called Web and New Media or Digital Media. The director insisted on naming the department Integrated Media because it was an expression of his philosophy that these kinds of technologies really serve a vital integrative role. They reach out into all of these other parts of the museum, and with all of these digital technologies, one of the things that makes them so challenging nowadays is that they don't neatly fit anywhere anymore. Even where 5 years ago there were things that were very clearly IT things. If your computer's not working, you know exactly who to call. You call the IT person, and hopefully they fix it. With a lot of the new technologies, particularly the social media ones, it's very difficult for it to logically sit one place in the organization. Like whose job would social media engagement be? Well, it's interpretation, it's education, it's marketing, it's public relations, it's curatorial. It is everything. It reaches into all of these areas. So therefore, I find that it becomes kind of difficult for people with a traditional museum mindset to figure out where this thing should live, and things that don't neatly fit in the model oftentimes are things that it's hard to get institutions to buy into. So one of the things that we've been working on here at the Peabody Essex Museum has been trying to shift the culture of the organization a little bit. Well, we've been trying to shift the culture of the organization a lot in many ways. One small way has been to try to encourage people to pursue their own interests in digital media and these technologies broadly, without trying to set up the expectation that we expect everyone to become an expert. You know, you can use social media without being a social media expert. There are plenty of people who, you know, take pictures with their phone who may not consider themselves photographers, and that's sort of a model I like to use a lot. So one of the things we've been trying with a pretty high level of success has been based on Carolyn Royston's computer club model that she started at the Imperial War Museums. And what we have been doing is trying to find areas of the technologies that we know staff are interested in, and then try to put together opportunities for the museum's staff to teach each other. So finding, you know, in pretty much any organization of any size, you'll probably find people who have higher levels of skills in certain areas, like there'll be the person who's very into Twitter. They know all about it. And finding ways to empower those people to share their own skills with the rest of the staff is a pretty good way of both disseminating that knowledge as well as making the culture one where people rely on each other rather than looking for either external sources, like we have to go find someone to teach us a class, or we can't do anything because we can't find anyone to teach us a class. You know, learning to rely on each other and to recognize the skills that people inside already have is a great way of building more of a culture where that kind of informal learning happens more naturally in the institution. You don't have to, you know, schedule a 3-hour workshop that people have to sign up for. And, you know, museums love process, right? And we love sometimes to create more process than is actually good for us. So trying to find ways where the barrier to entry is as low as possible while giving people access to skills is something that we have worked very hard at. So our version of Computer Club generally only meets at lunchtime when we know people are generally free. We will find somebody on staff who already has significant expertise in the thing that we're interested in, and we find that people like to learn from each other almost as much as they recognize the expertise of outside people. So a good example would be one of the sessions we did was we had a specific social media need. We really were interested in having staff share more frequently things that were going on at the museum. And when we would go around to talk to people, they would say, well, yeah, but I don't know how to use Twitter, or, you know, I'm not a good photographer. My pictures look terrible. And they had lots of expectations that they had placed on themselves that weren't necessarily realistic, like what counted as a good enough photograph for social media. So one of the more popular sessions we did was we're a large enough institution that we have a photography department. So we asked our staff photographers to just talk a little bit about the basics of photography and how could you take better pictures with your phone. And, you know, people came out of the woodwork because everyone was able to recognize, yes, our photographers know something about photography. They certainly know more about photography than I know. It's lunchtime. I have to eat lunch. They're serving pizza. What the heck? I will go and I will let them tell me a little bit about A, how to take pictures, and B, how to use my phone. And then, you know, for us on the social media team, then we also get to remind them, and when you're taking pictures with your phone, if it's in the museum, then you should share it. And here are the hashtags you should be using when you're sharing them. In that model, when we started off doing this, one of our big questions to ourselves was, would anyone even come? You know, everyone is busy, everyone is overworked. The feeling that there's yet another thing that you have to learn is oftentimes a huge obstacle to overcome. particularly when it comes to technologies. You feel like you've just learned the current crop of them, and then they change. You've just learned how to use whatever mail program you've learned to use on your computer, and the museum changes to a new one. We hear this over and over and over again, this perception that this is all like extra stuff, and it's something that sits outside of what you're supposed to do as a museum professional, and that's starting to change. But we are still in that awkward phase where most people working in museums came up with this 19th, 20th century model of you go to school, and school is when you learn, and you get a degree that, you get a credential that shows that you have learned, and then you're done, and you get a job, and now you are a professional, and you use the skills that you got during that time when you were in school, and that carries you all the way through your career until you retire and they throw you a party. And that's just not the way the world works anymore. But the museums are still full of people who came up with the expectation that they had successfully done what they needed to do in order to get all the way through their careers, and now that the ground has shifted underneath all of us. And it's not just in museums. I mean, you see it everywhere. Even in academia, like, what does it mean to be a professor nowadays, or a practicing academic is very different than even what it was 10 years ago. So one of the things that I'm most interested in is trying to bridge that gap of we know the way we would like our museum to function, and we know the staff that we currently have, and how do you get them to here and join up the skills with the job that we know needs to be done. And that's been very interesting work. Oh, I think I lost the sound.
No. Can you hear me now?
Hello?
Hey?
Oh, wait, there you are. Okay.
Okay.
Sorry, I should warn you, we're having severe thunderstorms here as well, so the power has flickered on me a couple of times. But,
okay.
Hopefully nothing bad will happen.
So I guess that one of the questions that we have about this, we have a lot actually. So how do you think is the right approach to introduce the idea that training is needed if your audience, like let's say there are curators and conservators, doesn't feel that they need to learn about new technology and platforms? How do they tell them, hey, you need to do this?
Well, I think one thing to think about is, I mean, it's very easy to get into sort of an us and them dynamic. There's the us who are the good people and the them who have different ideas, and trying to avoid that whenever possible is, I think, the only reasonable way to get any kind of broad-based success. Because what you're talking about, what I generally tend to tell people when I'm talking about this is that it is digital literacy is really sort of a core competency, regardless of what your functional role in the institution is. So it's not a question of should this be somebody's job as much as it really needs to be thought of institutionally as some part of this is everybody's job. More and more museums are starting to incorporate these things into new job descriptions. It's almost the equivalent of people. I've been around long enough to remember when people used to complain about having to use computers. Like, that's not my job. I have a typewriter that works perfectly well for what I need to do, and if you want to hire a specialist typist to type things up because we need to use computers, then sure, go right ahead. But nobody's having that discussion anymore, right? The computer has become a ubiquitous tool in the same way that the telephone became a ubiquitous tool, and digital media are following that same path. It's at that transition point from being something new to being like electricity or water. Nobody can reasonably say, no, I don't use electricity. That's not what I mean. Too bad. You really have to. And I think what I generally try to talk about when people have this conversation with me, this is something that happens at conferences all the time. For me, getting people to think about their own personal professional development as something that they need to be working on all of the time, regardless of where you are at your career, whether you're just starting out or whether you've been at it for a long time. Getting people to accept that notion that it's something you should be doing all of the time. It's bigger than just digital technologies. Like, what are you doing to learn new skills or to become better at what you're doing? If you can get people to have that conversation, even if they, if they go off and have it with themselves, then it becomes a lot easier to make things like talking about learning digital technologies less of a frightening topic and more just another thing that you should be doing anyway. And that's really the kind of institutional change that I'm interested in, is trying to build that kind of culture where people think of their own professional development as just something that you work on all the time, and it doesn't have to be a big thing. It doesn't have to be a huge commitment. You don't have to, quit your job and go get a degree in something, but all the time you should be carving out some time to experiment, to try out new things. Particularly in the realm of social media, one of the things that we have had to spend time doing is, just constantly keeping an eye open and an ear open for what's going on. Is there something new and exciting out there that we should be aware of? And if there is, well, go play with it. Being able to do that without feeling like it's a chore and it is somehow separate from what I'm supposed to be doing has probably been the most helpful thing to me, because I've certainly earlier on in my career felt much the same way. I've always been interested in new technologies, but after a while it can seem like a burden, and if you look at it as just another facet of what you're supposed to be doing as a professional, it becomes, I think, a lot easier conversation to have, particularly with people who have spent a great deal of time learning stuff. If you are, say, a textile conservator, think of how much time they've had to spend learning all the kinds of things they need to know about new technologies, new materials, new processes. That part of their job doesn't end, hopefully. They don't stop trying to find new ways to be better conservators. And these kinds of general digital skills, you can fit that in. You can be a better conservator by knowing more about digital media. Being able to communicate with your peers. Twitter is a great tool for that. Regardless of whether you're into the technology or not, if you are interested in being able to find your peers wherever they are, talk to them, have them find new information for you that you might be interested in, then suddenly social media stops becoming just another thing you have to play around with to something that is potentially useful for you. I'll give you another example. So one of them, we just did our first Wikipedia edit-a-thon 2 months ago, and I was working with two of our curators to identify assets to donate to Wikipedia. And for one of the curators who is interested in contemporary art, we wound up having a very interesting discussion about. It started off with, here's why you should care about Wikipedia. And you could see very clearly that at first it was something that was sort of out on the edge of what she considered to be what she did. But the more we talked about it, the more we came to the realization that something like Wikipedia was actually a way for her to interact with her artists in a way that she couldn't before, where she's working almost exclusively with contemporary artists, most of whom are still alive. These were Native American contemporary artists, so they are traditionally very underrepresented online. It's been very hard to find any information out about them. This Wikipedia upload for her becomes a way to maintain relationships with the artists that she's interested in. It becomes a way for the museum to spread the word about the artists that we collect, which is sort of a core museum function, right? We are saying these people are important because we have their artworks in our collection. And putting that information out on Wikipedia is another way of broadcasting that. So through the course of our conversations, we were able to think about collaborating with Wikipedia as being completely different from where we had started, which was, oh, it's a good thing to do. We're increasing global access to knowledge, to becoming a very straightforward sort of, oh yeah, this is a great way for me as a curator to curate and to maintain relationships and to build relationships, for artists whose works have been in the collection for a while, but we may not have talked with for a while or had their works on exhibition. It's a way of reminding them, oh, look, the Peabody Essex Museum has helped put a Wikipedia entry up for me. They're nice people, huh? And you can multiply that kind of example over many different platforms. We've just started recently really getting into Instagram, particularly because of the different characteristics of that platform and the level of engagement that people have with it. Even though we've tried other image sharing platforms before, like Pinterest and Flickr, and they've had their own affordances, but the way people are willing to share information and willing to actually communicate and not just share pictures has made working with Instagram something that a lot of different departments in the museum have been able to look at and say, oh, we want to do that because we want to talk with people and we want to use visuals as a way of doing that. And it becomes not a social media thing that marketing has to take care of, but it is something that particularly our education department becomes very interested in as part of their regular day-to-day job.
Oh, wow.
Hey.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Oh,
yes.
Okay, perfect. I have a question for you, Ed. So you mentioned that you already had your first training on how to take photographs. So
Sure.
Can you please tell us which are the other topics that you deal with, or like possible topic that can be useful for Italian museums to schedule their next training sessions?
Okay. I think the step before that is figuring out who in your museum is the person who is going to be the champion of this idea. Like, we need to be doing this, guys, and it could be anybody. I mean, in our particular case, we have a social media team, which was 4 of us, three people in marketing and me, and we had a number of objectives that we wanted to accomplish that we were having trouble with. So we had just launched a blog at that point, and the director had said, everybody needs to be blogging, particularly at the curators. This is going to be part of everybody's job in the future. So trying to get from there to actually getting people to be willing to give us information and to write stories for the blog was something we saw as a challenge that we had. And across all of our social media platforms, we had this impression that people felt like they didn't know enough about what our goals were as the museum to be able to interact with us on any of our channels. So we very clearly looked at what were the social media platforms that we knew people already used for whatever reason, and then started with those as sort of the least intimidating, lowest hanging fruits. So we started with Facebook and what the museum does on Facebook, and even asking like simple questions like, how many of you have Facebook accounts? How many of you who have actually liked the museum from your Facebook account? Many fewer people raised their hands. And how many of you have ever actually like shared something that you saw in your Facebook feed from the museum with your friends, which is sort of the point. And very few people had actually done that because a lot of people said in different ways, like, well, I wasn't sure if I was supposed to or not. So we had very limited ambitions starting out. We just wanted people to understand what we were doing and to tell them very specifically things that it seemed like they really needed to hear Like, you should like the museum's Facebook account. It is okay for you to share things that the museum posts on Facebook with your friends. Please, please. If it is interesting to you, share it. If it's not interesting, don't share it. That's the way social media are supposed to work. And people would, take notes, and they were all very serious. Like, oh, this is good to know. And the same for, Twitter. I led. It was at least an hour long. Might have been an hour and a half long session just on how do you use Twitter as a professional, because most people who had not experimented with Twitter were, and there were a lot of them, they had taken in this sort of mass media impression of Twitter is that it's just a bunch of self-absorbed people, taking pictures of their lunch, and it has no value to grown-ups. So in that regard, it was simply a matter of like putting up my Twitter feed on the big screen and showing people how Twitter works, what I do with Twitter, which is mainly find interesting people who are doing interesting things, and making the point that as a professional, Twitter is a great way of unearthing information. Twitter is basically, it is a way for you to curate this deluge of information that's coming in all the time. And the better you are at curating it, the more high-quality stuff you get out of it. And then we even, our ambition was to actually sign people up in the meeting. Like, who doesn't have a Twitter account? We are now going to show you how to sign up for Twitter right here, and make sure that they know how to actually follow the Peabody Essex Museum's Twitter account, so that by the time they were done, they knew just enough to be able to go off and experiment on their own. And all of the sessions we've done thus far have been sort of social media focused, and they had those very specific goals. Like, we're going to show you how the blog works. We're going to show you, tell you what our goals are for the blog, show you examples of blog posts that we think are successful, and then we actually had people like write down on pieces of paper ideas that they thought would make a good blog post, so that we could go back to them later and say, hey, that good idea you had for a blog post? Why don't you write it? And in all of these cases, we would wind up with 20, 25, 30 people showing up on their lunchtime, because they, by and large, knew that they needed to know more than they knew, but they didn't, they weren't comfortable sharing that to start with. We had a lot of people who were like, oh, thank goodness, I've always wanted to know more about Twitter, but I just, I couldn't be bothered. It was too hard to figure out on my own, and multiply that across every platform we talked about. You got the same response. So it was remarkably satisfying. We've done 5 of them thus far, and we're currently working on planning the next one. And for this coming year, we're actually looking at expanding beyond just social media. So the next thing we're looking at is, we use Google Docs. We use basically all of the Google apps. But most people have never gotten much in the way of really in-depth training. That it's on everybody's computers, but if you are already comfortable using the Google apps, then you do. If you're not, then you wind up using other things like Microsoft apps, and we have the people who will only use Microsoft Excel spreadsheets versus the people who will only use the Google spreadsheets, and the people who will only comment on documents as Microsoft Word documents, and the people who will only collaboratively edit a Google document, and trying to figure out ways to get people to be more comfortable using the same tools is something that I think we have a lot of room to improve on.
Ed, can I ask you something more about like technical aspect of the training?
Sure.
I just wanted to know, how often do you hold these sessions, and whether you ask people to bring their own tools like laptop or mobile, or if you use like they used to do at the Imperial War Museum with the common iPads. So which way?
Good question. We don't really have any computer lab facilities, so we don't have a place with 25 computers or iPads where we could set people up. So we've had to ask people to bring their own stuff, or the topics have been sort of general enough that people could follow along on their own, and then afterwards we would make all the presentations available internally. So if you wanted to go back to your desk and sign up for, whatever, Twitter, you could go download the PowerPoint presentation that we shared at the Brown Bag, and you could use that to help you get through the process. With the ones like digital photography, we specifically said bring your phone, and we'll show you how to use it. But it doesn't require having a whole ton of computers around. I mean, really, you need one computer, and you need one screen big enough that a bunch of people can see it, and somebody to drive. And you can do a lot just showing people how you go about doing what you do. I mean, particularly if you have somebody on board who is comfortable with whatever the tool is that you're trying to demonstrate. That's something that helps people a lot. Like if you know how to use Twitter effectively, then just being able to do it and talk about what you're doing while you're doing it becomes very valuable for people, even if they haven't signed up for an account yet. I mean, that was one of the things that I took away from our Twitter Brown Bag. Just being able to show people, like, if you look at my Twitter feed, it's almost entirely full of people pushing links to content, right? There's not a lot of stuff in there that are just people talking, and that's mainly the way that I use Twitter, because I'm interested in it as a discovery tool, and having that level of curation, like, okay, if Nancy Proctor says I should click on this link, I will click on this link because I know that she's a very smart woman and she knows a ton of stuff. And just saying things like that to people, is very helpful, and it's not the sort of thing you get from reading a book or looking at an online tutorial. People, I find particularly museum people, love to learn via the apprentice method, right? You want to see the person who you recognize as being the person who has more skills than you have, and say, like, okay, what are they doing? Okay, I will go do that now. We're kind of old-fashioned that way.
So we have been talking about the skills of the non-technology people in the museum. What about the fact that more and more the IT and the technology people is expanding in the museum?
Mm-hmm.
They're not anymore just in the IT office. They're not just the computer guy.
Yep.
What about their skills? I mean, the technology evolves at a very fast pace, and it's not realistic to assume that they will know every possible platform and every possible technology that is out there. So what are the skills that they need to have?
Well, so I think there are two different ways of looking at that. There are two interesting questions sort of embedded in that question. One that doesn't get a lot of attention, which I think is something that there's room for us to do a lot better at, is looking at the technology skills question from the other side. So we have lots of people who have lots of museum skills, and we want them to have technology skills, but more and more we're hiring lots of technology people, and there's also that corresponding need for them to learn museum skills, particularly when it comes to digital media. I mean, lots of the people coming in to the field to do digital stuff have zero museum background. So there's a huge cultural divide. If you're a computer programmer who's working on stuff, and you got a degree in computer science and you make computer programs and you know a lot about them, but you know nothing about cultural heritage. You know nothing about education. There's a tremendous need, I find, for more of that kind of information as well. And one of the hypotheses I have is that sort of the perfect museum of like 10 years from now will be one where you have the kind of continuous professional development around not only the new technologies but the old ones, and more importantly, sort of the philosophies of why we do what we do. There are tons of people who would benefit from knowing more about pedagogy. There are tons of people who would benefit from knowing more about the process of curation, as much as there are people who would benefit from knowing how to use any particular new digital media effectively. And that's something that I think we haven't even scratched the surface of yet. But to get back to your original question about what are the kind of skills that people in digital departments need to have, I think probably the biggest one that's not a technical skill is the ability to be a great communicator. Somebody who can talk to anybody about what they do in a way that is not frightening, heavily jargon-laden, and the ones who are good at it are the ones who are able to make the connections between what they do and what everybody else does, regardless of who you're talking to. You know, a lot of the people who are successful in being able to do interesting digital stuff in museums are people who are great coalition builders, right? So by and large, these people are not in positions of high authority where they can just say, "You will do what I tell you to do." You know, everything you do has to be done by making horizontal coalitions. You know, you want to do an interesting digital thing about conservation, then obviously you have to be able to get the conservators interested in what you're doing and get them to work with you, or the educators, or whoever else it is. So there are people who have these soft interpersonal skills that are really, really critical. And one of the current problems, I think, with a lot of the digital fields is they don't really teach you anything about how to like interact with people. You know, if you're someone who works in a museum, you're used to the notion that we communicate with the audience, right? The visitors who come in the door, we greet them, we make programs for them, we interact with them, and that gives you a certain ability to interact with human beings that is not necessarily part of the higher education of computer people. So that's probably the biggest thing that I would say that like trumps any kind of technical skill, because if you can't convince other people of the point you're trying to make, whatever the point is, then it's a lost cause.
Oh, okay, thank you. I have one more question about what about those small institutions that maybe don't have digital skills in their internal, like they don't have any, like you said, social media hero or something similar? What would you advise to ask someone else outside the museum, like agencies or whatever, for training? Or what would be a good solution, low-cost good solution?
That's an excellent question. I oftentimes, as someone who works in a fairly large museum, I often look with great envy at small museums, which is not always the case. But one of the great advantages that a small museum with no resources and no money has over larger institutions is that it's okay to just try something in a way that it's very hard to do in a large organization where everything is a meeting, everything is some elaborate approval process, and everything takes way longer than you think it will because you have to talk to so many people and involve so many people. I would say for like a small, poorly resourced museum, find something that you're interested in and just experiment. I mean, one of the great things about these technologies is that the barrier to entry is very low. You know, if you think you want to learn more about, you know, whatever, pick a social media platform, Facebook. Start playing around with it. You know, look and see what other museums are doing. One of the things that is probably the most beneficial nowadays is that there are so many communities that are starting to crop up online. I mean, one of the things I love most about this part of the profession is the community of people. You know, by and large, everybody you talk to is so happy to help, and they're willing to share their expertise with you, usually for free. I mean, you ask the question and they'll answer it, and that's kind of remarkable. So I think, especially if you're a small institution, just being able to do a little bit of snooping and asking, I think by and large Museums have trouble being comfortable with the notion that they are not the authorities, because that's what being a museum is all about, right? You are the authority on whatever your subject matter is. And in these cases where it's very clear that you're not the authority on a particular social media platform or a technology, just being okay with asking. So like for the Facebook example, there is a group that started in the last year called the International Museum Social Media Managers Facebook group. And they're from big museums, small museums, all over the planet, and they're very active. And they are very, very welcoming of people saying, like, I have a question, I don't know anything. And you can find those groups all over the place with a very little bit of sleuthing. And I think that's one of the things that, I think is so awesome about Sveli Museo. The fact that you guys are making it easier for people to even understand what's going on and figure out ways to learn more. I would imagine somebody could come to you, Francesca, and say, like, I don't know anything about blah, but we want to try something. Who might I talk to? And if they don't know, and they ask you, and you don't know, you probably have a bunch of people that you could ask as well, and eventually you would get them to an answer in a way that wasn't possible like years ago. It used to be that, if you had questions like this, or if I had questions like this before social media, I would try to save them up. And if I got to go to a conference that year, I'd have my list, things that I want to know about, and I'd try to go find all of the people at the conference who might be able to tell me that. And the rest of the year, I'd, twiddling my thumbs. I don't know how to solve this problem. And you don't have to do that anymore. If nothing else, social media has been great for that. I mean, just making it possible for people to really get the answers they need quickly. It's by no means a new thing. I mean, sure, there have been like email mailing lists for years, which would do the same thing. But social media, oh God, it can be so fast, and you can get such high quality answers back like that.
Wow, this is so inspiring. You're like a social media evangelist. It's great. Thank you. You should broadcast this interview all the time, just to make them realize how beautiful it is. It's wonderful. Thank you.
It can be.
So I think one last question. In thinking about museums like the Tate, that has the claim of the Tate digital strategy is digital as a dimension of everything. It's a pretty bold statement. Sure. What do you think are the other ways besides staff training to get there? And what are the boundaries to push it that far? And
interesting. Okay, the Tate, they are by and large philosophically way ahead of the pack. They're sort of the institution everybody looks to when they're like looking for examples of, okay, who's most likely to become a 21st century museum in the 21st century? And you're like, oh, Tate, probably. So one of the things I think the Tate has, they've hired some very smart people, specifically to do digital stuff. They also obviously have a director who has decided this is important. And I think that that is going to be a trend that I think you will see more and more coming to the fore. Is there will not only be this crop of people in the middle who are advocating for stuff and doing interesting things and making names for their institutions because of the stuff they're doing, but you will also start to see more and more people coming into executive leadership positions who make that part of their mandate as, this is what's going to happen while I'm director. We are going to figure out how to do this better, differently, more efficiently, what have you. So, even just little examples like the director of the Peabody Essex Museum, Dan Monroe, saying that, we're not going to call this department Web and New Media because he didn't want it to be a ghetto, a silo where, all of the digital stuff will only happen here, and it's nobody else's job to worry about. It's these guys. If you look at, let's see, who would be other examples? The Tate is a great one. Well, so the Royal Ontario Museum in Canada, their director Janet Carding, when she started, made it very clear to all of her staff that she had a particular vision for how she thought the organization needed to operate that was very collaborative, that was not quite so siloed. There's this department and that department, and they're completely separate. And instituted lots of initiatives to make that happen, like their social media presence. ROM has a great social media program. They start hiring people like directors of audience engagement. You start seeing these new positions crop up. That is only stuff that can happen because you have that highest level foresight. So I think that is probably the next big piece that needs to come into place more broadly in the field. I mean, you're starting to see many more people at the deputy director and director level who lean that way and think that way, but that is a trend that really needs to sort of spread throughout the field more, and eventually everybody will start thinking that way.
Okay. Okay. So I think we are done. If you do you have anything else to add?
Me? Oh,
yeah,
I could go on forever. Those are the big things. I guess the last thing I will say one last thing. One of the things that the Tate does very well. So if you read any of their digital strategy documents, like Digital is a Dimension of Everything, one of the things that is my hope, certainly, and I think a hope that's more and more widely shared, is that while we're talking about transformation, digital is getting to the point where my hope would be that it ceases to be a thing in the near future. Like there are museums hiring chief digital officers, and there are all kinds of digital strategies and digital this and digital that, because digital is new and it doesn't have a place to live yet. So people create entire new departments. So now there's the digital publishing department and the digital media department. Even though there was a publishing department and there was a media department before that, this is somehow new and different. So I really hope that it is not too terribly long before those things start to go away. Once we actually manage to shift the culture to the place where we think it needs to be, then it would seem logical to me that you'd stop needing to have a chief digital officer. Once digital does become a dimension of everything, then it becomes like electricity and water. It stops being a separate thing unto itself. You don't have like a chief telephone officer, or fill in the blank. That's sort of my long-term aspiration, would be to get to the point where digital people are kind of superfluous because everybody's doing it. You stop being a digital media producer, you're a media producer. You stop being a digital educator, you're an educator, and you use these tools, and that's all they are. They're new tools, and they do some things better than other things, which is why we like them. But they're not the be all and the end all. We are still in this awkward phase where they're sort of new and shiny, and people love to fixate on the digital part of it, but it's not. Digital is an adjective. It's the thing that comes after it that's the important thing, right? It's digital engagement, digital education, digital curation. That's the important part. Digital is just another interesting way to do it.
Wow, that's great and very true. And I think we can thank you. By the way, you were great. I mean, really, and we think you deserve our special stickers from Sveglia Museo. I don't know if you see them.
I love stickers.
Oh, we will send them.
All right.
To you tomorrow.
All right,
Right
I'll let you know when
You really deserve it.
I will certainly post them
Speaking
on.
of the Royal Ontario Museum. Oh, sorry, I didn't hear. Okay. I don't know if you hear me.
It's a little bit wonky.
When I get your thing.
Ah, okay.
Yes, it's a little bit wonky, Francesca.
Sorry.
Do you want me to say?
Yeah, just I was saying.
Okay, so, well, thank you, Had. Oh, it's so difficult. Oh, Francesca.
Yeah.
Francesca.
Yeah.
Well, okay, I'm gonna speak. Okay, I'm gonna talk.
Yeah.
Thank you, Had, for being with us and for this super interesting presentation. Sorry for the technical problems. And yeah, we are gonna have another appointment speaking about the Royal Ontario Museum next week, same time. We're gonna have Ryan Dodge from the Royal Ontario Museum. So yeah, stay tuned.
Ryan's
and yeah, okay. Thank you so much, and bye bye.
Keep up the good work.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Woo.
All right. Ciao.
Ciao.
Ciao.